Mom?
There are horror films, and then there are horror films that quietly creep under your skin before you even realize what's happening. And when I first saw the early images and poster for a new film called Red Riding, something about it immediately caught my attention. Not just the gothic atmosphere, not just the eerie forests, but the strange feeling that this movie might be doing something far darker with the story we all think we know, because on the surface, Red Riding looks like a modern retelling of the classic Little Red Riding Hood tale. But the deeper I looked, the clearer it became that this isn't just another fairy tale adaptation. This is a story where folklore collides with brutal reality, and the result feels more like a nightmare than a bedtime story. The film is produced by Neil Marshall, a name horror fans immediately recognize. Marshall is the filmmaker behind cult classics like The Descent, Dog Soldiers, and Doomsday. Those movies helped define modern British horror. So when his name appears on a project, expectations automatically rise. But what makes Red Riding especially interesting is the director behind the camera. Craig Conway, who previously appeared in several of Marshall's films, steps into the director's chair for this project. And from everything we're seeing so far, Conway isn't playing it safe. Instead, he's taking one of the most recognizable folk stories ever told and dragging it into a much darker, more disturbing world. The story centers around a troubled teenager named Riddell Riding, played by Victoria Tate. And right from the beginning, her life is already falling apart. Riddell grows up in a bleak social housing complex in London, living with her mother, Scarlett, who is deeply addicted to drugs. Their life together is chaotic, unstable, and constantly on the edge of collapse. Red spends most of her days trying to survive emotionally in an environment where stability simply doesn't exist, but everything changes when her mother dies from a drug overdose. Suddenly, the only family Red is left is someone she barely even knows. Her wealthy, aristocratic grandmother, who lives far away in the Scottish Highlands, and that's where the story takes its first major turn. Red is taken away from the grey, oppressive world of London and transported to a massive estate hidden deep in the countryside. At first, the place feels almost surreal to her. The mansion is enormous. The landscape is breathtaking. The entire environment feels like stepping into another world, but something about it doesn't feel right, because beneath the elegance of the estate, there's an unsettling tension that Red quickly begins to notice. There are whispers about children who have disappeared. There are rumors of a terrifying wolf-like creature wandering through the nearby forests, and the people living inside the estate don't behave the way you'd expect. Her grandmother, played by Lindsay Beauchamp, appears refined and powerful on the surface, but there's a coldness to her that Red can't ignore. The servants seem loyal, but also strangely nervous, and the estate's groundskeeper carries an intimidating presence that feels almost threatening. The deeper Red digs into the family's past, the more disturbing the truth becomes, because it slowly becomes clear that this family has been hiding secrets for generations, and those secrets may be connected to something far older than Red ever imagined. The screenplay, written by Peter Stilianu, blends elements of classic fairy tale mythology with psychological horror and brutal realism. Instead of simply retelling the familiar Little Red Riding Hood story, the film twists the narrative into something much darker. The wolf isn't just a monster in the woods. It might represent something far more human, or perhaps something even worse. As the story unfolds, Red begins to uncover clues left behind by her mother, strange warnings, fragments of the past, hints that her mother once tried to escape this same place years earlier, and suddenly Red begins to wonder whether the danger surrounding her isn't coming from the forest at all. Maybe the real threat has been inside the mansion the entire time. The supporting cast adds even more depth to the unsettling atmosphere. Bill Fellows, known to many viewers from Ted Lasso, appears as one of the estate's ominous figures. Ian White, who audiences may recognize from Alien vs. Predator and Game of Thrones, plays the mysterious figure connected to the wolf legend surrounding the property, and every new detail about the film seems to reinforce the same idea. This is not a comfortable horror movie. This is a story about inheritance, about family legacy, about the terrifying possibility that some things we inherit are far darker than we realize. One of the most interesting aspects of Red Riding is the way it explores the theme of nature versus nurture. Early in the film, a teacher tells Red something that almost sounds like a throwaway line: "Our DNA may shape us, but it doesn't have to define us." It's a simple idea, but it becomes one of the central questions of the entire story, because Red spends most of the film trying to answer one terrifying question: is she destined to become like the family she comes from? Or can she break free from that legacy? And as the events of the film spiral further into violence and psychological horror, that question becomes harder and harder to answer. The movie also leans heavily into gothic horror traditions. The massive estate, the mist-covered forests, the feeling of isolation from the outside world, all of it builds an atmosphere that feels almost timeless, but at the same time, the film isn't afraid to push into extremely uncomfortable territory. Some scenes reportedly explore themes of control, abuse, and the darker side of aristocratic power. The idea that wealth and privilege can hide horrific secrets beneath a polished surface is something horror films have explored before, but Red Riding seems determined to push that concept even further, and that's where the film may divide audiences, because while some viewers may appreciate its willingness to challenge the traditional fairy tale narrative, others might find its darker elements deeply unsettling. But in many ways, that's exactly what horror is supposed to do. It's supposed to make us uncomfortable. It's supposed to force us to confront the things we'd rather not think about, and based on everything we know so far, Red Riding seems ready to do exactly that. The film made its world premiere on March 7, 2026, at Frightfest during the Glasgow Film Festival. For a debut feature from Craig Conway, that's a significant moment. Frightfest has long been known as a platform for bold and unconventional horror films, and Red Riding certainly seems to fit that description. Whether audiences ultimately embrace the film or reject its darker themes, one thing is already clear: this is a project that people are going to talk about, because sometimes the most disturbing stories aren't the ones about monsters in the woods. Sometimes the real horror comes from the families we inherit, and if Red Riding truly leans into that idea the way it appears to, this might end up being one of the most controversial and thought-provoking horror debuts we've seen in years. And honestly, that's exactly the kind of movie that keeps the horror genre alive. If you enjoy films that twist familiar stories into something darker, something stranger, something that makes you question what's really hiding beneath the surface, then this is definitely one to keep on your radar, because once Red Riding opens the door to its world, it might be very difficult to walk away from it. And trust me, stories like this tend to stay with you long after the credits roll. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. This is where these kinds of films come to life. Until the next story, stay curious, be critical, keep your eyes on the screen, and remember, every film you haven't seen is a new film.